2 million copies sold in just 10 days. It's a record for From Software, and it's strong evidence that single-player games continue to remain popular, and yes, even exceptionally difficult ones. To many, this likely doesn't come as a surprise. After all, not every player out there is chasing the next big multiplayer experience. But with the avalanche of large-scale, massive AAA titles, it's easy to feel that the single-player experience has been lost. But the truth is that single-player games are not only doing well, but they continue to set new standards. I'm Obsidian Ant, and welcome to another episode of OA Gaming. With the rise of multiplayer games, MMOs, and now live service games, it's easy to feel that the once gold standard of gaming is falling into disuse. That gold standard, of course, is compelling single-player titles, the place where video gaming, for the longest time, built its player base. Yet, despite record profits in multiplayer games and the associated microtransactions arena, single-player games continue to do well and not only meet expectations, but exceed them. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice arrived on the scene on 22nd of March, launching on PC, Xbox and PlayStation. Being from the studio behind Dark Souls, there were naturally some fairly high expectations for the title. Yet even still, the game generated record sales for the studio From Software. 2 million copies sold in the first 10 days alone, compared to Dark Souls 3 taking 2 months to hit that same number. These are good numbers for From Software, and they're also good numbers for players because they highlight that single-player games still have legs. Over the past years, a number of studios and publishers, most notably EA, have gone on record stating that single-player games are not as widely enjoyed as they once were. These statements, combined with the continued push for multiplayer and live service games, have understandably led many players to assume the worst, that AAA studios, or more specifically, large publishers, are abandoning the single-player market. Aside from the seeming outliers like CD Projekt Red and the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077, it often feels like there is very little news on the single-player games. But that's just not the case. Single-player games are actually in a very, very good place. So why is it then that there's a narrative that single-player games are dying? Well, there's a number of things to consider here, and 2 of them are pretty important and explain a whole lot. Firstly, by their very nature, live service games and most multiplayer games are designed for long-term play. They receive regular updates, run community events, often court controversy, and generate ongoing profits, sometimes doing so year after year. It's only natural then that these titles would continually generate news, information, and stories that hit the gaming press. When compared to that, a single-player title really is the antithesis. Regular updates, community events, etc. are generally not an ongoing thing for single-player titles. Yet, even still, when a title hits big, it really does hit it big. Sekiro is just the latest example. 2018, meanwhile, had a whole bunch of titles. God of War hit it big on the PlayStation, almost instantly becoming the platform's fastest ever selling title. Mere months later, this was outperformed by Marvel's Spider-Man. Both of these titles are immensely fun. God of War in particular has an absolutely amazing story that left me wanting more. Spider-Man, meanwhile, simply has an amazing open world to explore, and it does it with compelling mechanics. Again, I couldn't get enough of this game. In my opinion though, both of these titles pale in comparison to what was easily my favourite title of recent times, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Probably one of the best stories ever told in video games, and that's not hyperbole, but it is of course my own personal opinion. And if you haven't checked Hellblade out yet, it's well worth taking a look. And if you happen to own a Switch, the game has just released on that platform. Now, talking of the Switch, it of course represents perhaps the ultimate single-player platform. Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Mario, Octopath Traveler are all great titles into which players have sunk many hours. Meanwhile, dozens of upcoming single-player games are generating a lot of interest. The Outer Worlds, Animal Crossing, a personal favourite of mine would you believe, Cyberpunk 2077, Death Stranding, Days Gone, The Last of Us Part 2, and many others besides. But when taking a look at upcoming single-player titles, there often appears to be a feeling from some quarters on the absence of the large 3 publisher studios, that is Blizzard, Activision, EA and Ubisoft. But the truth is, these studios do have titles coming up. Ubisoft of course have both Good and Evil 2, meanwhile EA have Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now Fallen Order is a particularly interesting title here because the publisher behind them, EA, have of course been the target of ire from the gaming community for many years. Generally speaking, they are a very much disliked company. Most notably, many people feel that EA are responsible for ruining loved franchises such as Mass Effect, not to mention the company's terrible stance on microtransactions, which was very obvious with Star Wars Battlefront 2, and their awful take on live service games with Anthem. We all know EA have a very bad reputation for fleecing game players after all. And so, it seems most strange to hear EA talk about their upcoming title, Fallen Order, in awed tones. It's a true single-player experience, and EA promise that the game will not contain any multiplayer elements, and they also promise it won't contain any microtransactions. EA also state that they have no intent on adding any of these things after launch either. Now naturally, this has attracted a lot of positive attention from both gamers and the media, yet a cynic might feel that EA are attempting to ride the tides of success from other recent single-player titles, and also, they may be riding or putting a marketing spin on the hate and dislike towards microtransactions and live service titles. Yet to be fair, the studio behind Fallen Order is none other than Respawn, the studio that produced the immensely successful Apex Legends and Titanfall. And with other industry veterans from games such as God of War and the Uncharted series also working on Fallen Order, it seems very likely that for once, just maybe, EA are taking a step back and giving one of their studios free rein. Perhaps then, EA have realised what Sony understood long ago. For Sony, single-player titles are system sellers, and if players are willing to buy a console based on an exclusive single-player game, it should naturally send bells ringing over at EA, letting them know that there's tons of money to be made in single-player titles. Perhaps then, the story isn't one of single-player games dying, just maybe the story is a different one entirely, a story of noise to signal ratio, with the larger multiplayer games generating a lot of noise both from publishers, marketing arms and players alike. Maybe it's also a story of growing bad practices among an increasing number of live service games, which in turn are reflected by news piece after news piece in the gaming press. Not to mention, of course, the genuine successful multiplayer titles like Apex Legends generating a streamer, media and player frenzy. It's not hard then to see why genuine gems can get buried among all of this. Yet there's a lot of single player gems out there to be sure, both in existing releases and upcoming releases. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.